Welcome everyone to our Conversations for Our Times Zoom series. This is the last one for this season. Apparently we've been okayed for a third season next year, but this will be our last session for this year. And we're very thrilled to have with us Douglas Roche. I'm so happy that he has accepted to share with us his own wisdom on what is so desperately needed in our days, which is developing, a culture of peace. So I'd like to begin with a statement of welcome and a land acknowledgement. So we at St. Basil's Parish regard the love of God to be the foundation of all life and ministry. We believe in the ever-present love of God as witnessed through Christ and empowered by the Holy Spirit. We believe that each person is loved by God and is of sacred worth. Therefore, through God's grace, we welcome all persons to our parish community. We express God's hospitality by creating a safe and healing, accessible and transforming place for all to enter. Further, we acknowledge with gratitude and respect that we gather in this region on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin First Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. We honor their long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory, and we uphold and uplift the voices of our host nation. I'm going to ask people to mute themselves. Thank you. And now I turn it over to Kevin Burns. Thank you.
Thanks, Father Winkler. So technical notes, this is a conversation for our times, and I ask that you send your questions well in advance. As soon as you have a question, put it in the chat box, send it to me directly or send it to everybody, your choice, and I will frame those questions to guide our conversation in what follows. To hope or not to hope? Well, when you have a title like that, a Catholic institution really ought to turn to a monk for wisdom. Since Thomas Merton wasn't available, we've had to go to a different monk, and that's Kathleen Monk. And Kathleen Monk, we are delighted to say, is a member of our parish community. You will know her through her many, many appearances on television as a political commentator. She has a public relations firm as a strategist. She is a journalist, knows what to do in these issues and how to address these issues. She will be if you could mute Donna, please, thank you. And she will be guiding us also in the conversation, question and answer part of our session this afternoon. So Kathleen Monk has the job to introduce our guest today. Kathleen, over to you.
Thanks so much, Kevin, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to tell a little bit of a family joke just quickly off the top. My mother, like many young women who grew up in Quebec at her age, joined the nunnery. She left, actually, and did not become a sister, but she did marry a monk. So it was as close as it could get. So that's the one joke we have in my family. So there you go. She wanted to become a nun, but married a monk instead. Anyhow, I wanted to say, a warm personal welcome to all of you, especially St. Basil parishioners who are joining us. And I know many others are joining us virtually, community members and friends from further afield. So thanks so much for tuning in. It's so great that we could get together on a Sunday afternoon like this. Before I introduce Mr. Roche, I would like to set the stage a little bit, if you will, and I'll call on a native of Ottawa, Bruce Cockburn, a musical artist that many of you may know. And he wrote that famous song, Lovers in a Dangerous Time. And I'd like to set the stage and say we really are living in quite a dangerous time, increasingly faced by many global threats that Mr. Roche will speak to today. The extent of the dangers and the problems we're facing in the 21st century can seem really daunting and really upsetting and quite dark. We're living through a period that's been riddled through so many challenges, economic inequality, widespread economic inequality across our globe. Obviously, a global pandemic that we've all just lived through in terms of COVID that took 6 million lives globally. Growing hostility we've seen to our institutions, particularly growing hostility towards democracy, including obviously the threat and the challenge to the U.S. Capitol on January 6th that we're hearing so much about in the news just over a year and a half ago. And obviously the devastating challenges that we see with climate change, forest fires, catastrophic droughts, and deadly heat waves that have taken so many lives. So it can be quite dreary. And on top of that, on February 24th of this year, we saw Russia's invasion, unprovoked attack on Ukraine. And that seemed to almost shatter the peace that we've been living with in this rules-based international order that really we have all enjoyed and prospered through since the Second World War. It jolted us and brought fear to many. And obviously, it's now in its 108th day. It's still ongoing. And it's been a real moment that's been calling on all of our leaders, on all of our citizens, really, to both take action, but also at the same time to reflect, because it seems like we are at a really important moment. A transformational moment is what I believe Mr. Roche will term it. And we're being asked, our politicians, our leaders are being asked, we're also being asked to reshape what Canada's role is internationally and how we want to define it. We're being asked to carve out a significant role in the globe, and we need to figure out what we want that role to be. What should we focus on? What will be most effective? And most of all, what I posed off the top is like, how do we not dismay about all of this and just turtle in some ways, but actually lean in and be inspired? Well, the exciting thing is that I think Douglas Roche has an answer for that, because our very esteemed guest is not only an inspirational diplomat and a politician, he actually holds that space, as Kevin said off the top. He holds space for hope, and he holds space for peace. And ultimately, it's his idea that if we can hold space for hope and hold space for peace, that we can actually bring humanity together. And isn't that interesting? Because that is really almost like an echo of a Lester B. Pearson quote from his famous speech that he did when he won the Nobel Prize almost 65 years ago. And at the time, Pearson said, how can there be peace without people understanding one another? And how can this be if they don't know one another? With the power of Douglas Roche's experience and his wisdom, obviously his years of exploring these issues of peacemaking and diplomacy, he will hopefully help us come to some of these answers and hold a little hope this afternoon. He's going to take some time with us, not only to present some of his ideas, but then hopefully take your questions. So I really urge you to start thinking about what things we want to ask Mr. Roche at the end of his presentation. He, as you know, probably by now, if you've registered for today, you know that he's a distinguished author of many books, numerous books, a parliamentarian, a senator, and a diplomat, and a 50-year career in peace and human security issues. He has lived in those corridors of power, and he brings to us today his wisdom and his experience from that. So before I turn it over to Mr. Roche, I just want to say that the best quote I think I've ever read in a long time is one that he has said, which is that hope is a verb. And with that, I turn it over to Mr. Roche and say thank you. Please, everyone, join me in welcoming Mr. Roche for this afternoon's discussion.
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you very much. I only know you through your star appearances on television, but I'm very happy to meet you in this medium. Kevin began by referring to monks that we need to resolve the difficulties of our world today. And I have to quickly insert that in as much as I have 5 children, I don't qualify as a monk, but I do have some background and in the United Nations, and it's the UN that I want to talk about a bit today. The Russian war in Ukraine is bogged down, and no one knows how it will end. The West is dispirited and frantically pouring billions of dollars the more war machinery that might well end in nuclear conflict. So this is not a strategy with a hopeful future. It's time to look beyond NATO, which only offers more militarism, and fix our eyes on the United Nations, which can build up the possibilities for a more peaceful world. Many people think that the UN can't do anything to establish peace because of the veto system in the Security Council. And under the arcane rules of the Security Council, any one of the 5 permanent members can cast a veto, which will stop any movement forward on a given issue. And that, of course, happened when there was a resolution condemning the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was vetoed by Russia. And it's not likely that Russia or even any of the other permanent members of the Security Council will support any move to eliminate the veto. So we're living with that situation. So what can we do? Well, we turn to the General Assembly. General Assembly is where all 193 members of the UN meet. And the General Assembly is now challenging the Security Council by expanding what is called the Uniting for Peace series of resolutions. The Uniting for Peace device goes back many, many years in the UN, but it has not been used enough. And it provides an alternative course of action when a permanent member uses its veto to obstruct the Security Council. So on March the 2nd of this year, the General Assembly voted by a vote of 141 in favor, 5 opposed, and 35 abstentions to adopt a resolution demanding that the Russian Federation immediately end its invasion of Ukraine and unconditionally withdraw its military forces. The representative of the European Union put the matter really concisely on the value of this resolution. He said, this is not just about Ukraine. This is not just about Europe. This is about defending an international order based on rules. This is about whether we choose tanks and missiles or dialogue and diplomacy. Well, this vote showed the isolation of Russia in the world community. And it was followed up by another resolution offered by Liechtenstein, which had 83 co-sponsors, including Canada, which set out a course in which from now on, when a permanent member of the Security Council casts a veto in the Security Council, there will automatically be set in motion a debate in the General Assembly in which the Security Council member has to go and explain the vote, and thus causing a worldwide debate through the General Assembly. This Uniting for Peace resolution is seen as an important step in strengthening the United Nations accountability. You know, it's true that Uniting for Peace resolutions cannot by themselves stop a war, but they show the growing momentum for accountability within the UN system. This mandatory debate mechanism opens up an opportunity for the General Assembly to take a strong and united view on issues of peace. And I believe truly that the world can speak more clearly through a revitalized General Assembly. This moment in history that we're passing through, I call it a dark moment, the Ukraine war, is calling on us to recognize a right to peace, that people have a right to peace. That the Ukraine issue is flagrantly, bringing us up to the top of our attention list, that we have to find a way around war as a means of resolving conflict. And I think we should take a little bit of inspiration from the words of John F. Kennedy, the president of the United States, who in 1963, during the height of the Cold War, said that we can move forward in building conditions for peace, not by expecting a sudden revolution in human nature, but on a gradual evolution in human institutions. So strengthening the UN system is a way to advance the concept of the right to peace, which flows out of the work, the overall work of the United Nations in arms control and disarmament, environmental protection, human rights, economic and social development. All the main fields of activity in the UN flow into the expression of a culture of peace. We want to move the world from the old culture of war that has dominated the 20th century, and which we're now seeing a resurgence of in the Ukraine, into a culture of peace. This is not a matter for soft people or people who are looking for a quick solution. This long-range view requires a vision of humanity and to cooperating for mutual survival. Can we do this? We must find a way. We're going to see ourselves through this present crisis. We cannot depend on more militarism to bring us peace. So we are, for the moment, and many people think that we're trapped. We can't get out of this Ukraine situation, and those who are calling for negotiations are now being written off by the forces of militarism that say only more guns, more ammunition will resolve the situation. I'm not so sure about that. I believe that, of course, it's a fact that all wars end. They will end somehow. So it would be a lot better to end the Ukraine war through a set of negotiations than through a perpetuation of a military policy in which one side is determined to defeat the other. It takes some vision, as I've said, to get beyond the headlines and the propaganda issued by both sides of this war to advance a longer view. Well, the whole business of the United Nations is to advance the long view, while it's also helping in a humanitarian way in the short range. So it's operating in two spheres, if you like, at the same time. In 2016, the General Assembly did adopt a resolution on a declaration on the right to peace. And that declaration said, everyone has the right to enjoy peace, such as that all human rights are promoted and protected and development is fully realized. Well, some will say, well, it's only a declaration. Well, that's true, but so was the declaration. So was the declaration on the universal human rights that was established in 1948. Only a declaration at the time. But what it did was that it raised the level of discourse and understanding of human rights in all its dimensions over the succeeding years and decades. And we had covenants on economic and social rights and political and civil rights. And of course, that it led into the famous Resolution 1325 in the Security Council on the rights of women in the world. And then it various other categories of persons with indigenous and children's rights, disabled. So the extension of human rights that we now viscerally feel in our society today came about as a result of this declaration in 1948. Well, I'm contending that the Declaration on the Right to Peace is setting the stage for a wider understanding of nonviolence as a route to a more peaceful world. We have to move in this direction. We cannot have human rights in all their dimensions fully exercised in the world, leading to the right to peace, if we at the same time have weapons of mass destruction that we're constantly threatening to use. And Mr. Putin's statement that an implied threat that he would use nuclear weapons has reawakened people to the dangers that exist now in the 13,000 nuclear weapons that are in existence today, and the failure of the nuclear weapon states to adhere to their obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to enter into comprehensive negotiations for the total elimination of nuclear weapons. So we need to bring back to the forefront of our thinking that if we're going to have a peaceful world, we've got to get rid of nuclear weapons, and we have to advance the ideas of a culture of peace, preparing the way for our society to accept a right to peace. And in this gathering that we're having today, I really want to emphasize this, how important it is that in our darkest days going through the Ukraine war, that we not give in and say, well, we're fated. We are not fated for war and death and destruction if we can assert the principles and the basis of the Charter of the United Nations. We must use that as an anchor for our thinking and how we're going to proceed ahead. I want to close with a quote again from President Kennedy, because I think that his speech that he gave to American University in June of 1963, that said at the height of the Cold War, was prescient in establishing the conditions needed in the world today, not least in his own country, and certainly a good way for Canadians to think about how to proceed. Kennedy said, "Some say that it is useless to speak of peace or world law, or world disarmament, that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union, or read Russia, adopt a more enlightened attitude. I hope they do," he said. "I believe we can help them do it, but I also believe that we must re-examine our own attitude as individuals and as a nation. For our attitude is as essential as theirs. Let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct our attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future, and we're all mortal." Well, those words from President Kennedy have lived on and need to be recalled today as we're trying to find a way out of the dilemma posed by the Russian war in Ukraine. That war must be condemned. But heinous as it is, it does not invalidate the right to peace that people have. And if anything, it reinforces the overriding imperative of building a world structure. Well, we already have that world structure. It's called the United Nations. And we too often, particularly in the Western world, lose sight of the values for the human condition that have been established and built up by the United Nations in its wide range of work. It's got 20 or 25 agencies that work in children's, refugees, development, women's, and migration. I mean, it's a whole range of issues. And what it is doing is trying to build up a respect for international law. And again, I say, just because Russia has so flagrantly, blatantly violated international law does not diminish the need for us to reestablish our belief and our intention of shoring up international institutions that operate on a basis of international law and cooperation. So I'm certainly here calling for a worldwide ceasefire in all wars that are going on today, and particularly in Ukraine, and that we turn our attention to the existential threats that are constantly with us and that transcend all borders. Here I'm talking about the threat of COVID and future pandemics, threat of climate change, which is so apparent to us today. What the warming of the climate is doing to our environment, and the perpetuation of nuclear weapons, the buildup of or the modern, as it's now called, the modernization of nuclear weapons, and those who have them not getting rid of them, they are modernizing and building new systems that will take nuclear weapons through the rest of this century. So these existential threats of the pandemic and the climate and nuclear weapons need to be addressed by a conglomerate of countries working together. We cannot afford any longer to work in isolation. We need to have a vision to take us out of the darkest days that we're passing through today, now, and establish ways in which we can have more collaboration and partnership to build common security. That is what I fervently hope the Canadian government will return to. For in earlier days, the government of Canada was one of the leaders at the United Nations in establishing the principles of common security. And that is to say that no country is safe unless all countries are safe. No country is secure unless we're all secure. And that is a role for Canada. And Canada needs to get beyond its reliance on NATO as a means of expressing our intentions in the world and return to a vigorous injection of money, political energy, and talent, and furtherance of the ideas of the agenda for peace that is at the root of the United Nations. It is by turning our attention from war to peace that we build hope. And that is why I dare to say that even in these dark days that we're going through, I have not lost my sense of hope. I believe in a strong United Nations. I believe that Canada ought to be at the forefront of building the conditions for peace in the world. Thank you.
Well, there's a thunderous round of applause happening digitally to what you just said there. Let's begin. The first questions are absolutely linked to United Nations issues. So the first one is, how did Canada vote in that UN General Assembly resolution?
Canada voted to condemn Russia for its invasion and the war in Ukraine. Canada also voted for the resolution. It turned out to be a consensus resolution in which all permanent members of the Security Council who cast a veto from now on will have to go and explain themselves in the General Assembly. So Canada was on the favorable side on those.
A follow-up question on the UN is, how invested is Canada in the revitalization of the United Nations?
Well, I think that, they would say that they are invested, but they're more invested in NATO than they are in the UN today. And I say that very sadly. The amount of money going into the defense budget is immense. It's over $32 billion now, and it's slated to keep rising. And the amount of money that we put into international development assistance, while it's growing too, it's still at a much lower level, and it's only at about 0.3% of our GDP. Canada has a background to fall on here, in which we have used the United Nations as a vehicle to express ourselves. I mean, informally, Canadian foreign policy was sort of in two main areas. First area was the United States, bilateral relations with the United States because of the importance of that country to our entire systems here in Canada. And secondly, our involvement in the extended United Nations family of agencies and how we express ourselves internationally through the UN. And that has always been, that was traditionally Canada's, what you might call the framework for our foreign policy. Now, our foreign policy is being driven by NATO. And I believe that this is wrong to have a Western military alliance driving what we say and do. And if you want an example of it, I'll give it to you. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is now going to be meeting for the first time in Vienna in a few days. And because NATO is so opposed to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, because NATO continues to insist that nuclear weapons are the supreme guarantee of security, NATO is calling the shot, so to speak, with its NATO members in not even attending the meeting in Vienna as an observer. And so I think that we need to press the government of Canada through our local members of parliament. I mean, constantly the members tell me, I'm in touch with them all the time, that they don't receive much feedback from people on UN subjects or on subjects of nuclear disarmament. And so we need to express ourselves so that those who are making policies in Canada recognize that there is a body of opinion, an informed body of opinion in Canada that wants to express a vision and a means of moving forward on the issues of arms control and disarmament, environmental protection, economic and social development, and human rights, which constitute the core of the agenda for peace. You won't find that agenda in NATO. It is at the heart of the United Nations, and that's what we should be concentrating on.
I've got one more United Nations related question, and then we move on to some quite different perspectives. But on the UN front, how can how can the United Nations veto power that you described that both Russia and China have?
How can it what?
How can the United Nations be more effective
Oh.
with the veto power, against the veto power, I guess, of Russia and China?
Yes, well, the veto power is possessed by all 5 permanent members of the Security Council: Russia, China, United States, Britain, and United States, Britain and France, Russia and China. Now, the vetoes laterally have been cast mostly by Russia and to some extent China. But as I've said, it's very difficult to get around the veto that was built into the system of the UN. The major states said at the time in 1945 that they would not join if they did not have a veto. So we have to live with it. But that being said, this doesn't mean the UN can do nothing. The UN has done plenty in establishing treaties, in its peace building work, peace building commissions, the negotiations that it has conducted in many wars around the world, and now in this latest instance, by having a new mechanism by which the states that cast a veto will have to go and explain themselves in the General Assembly, is itself a step forward in revitalizing the United Nations. So we must be very careful not to denigrate the UN just because it cannot stop the war by itself. It's what we have to do is evolve, as Kennedy said, to evolve the UN into a stronger, more vigorous instrument for peace.
I want to shift the focus to this question. What role would you say the world's religions have in creating peace? Do they have a practical role, or is it only a kind of spiritual praying role? How do you react to that?
Well, I would take a little issue with using the word only spiritual. I mean, the spiritual is a very powerful means of expressing our relationship between ourselves and our Creator. And it's a basis of human rights, how we are extending to one another the rights that we want for ourselves, and that are found in a full examination of God's creation. The UN has been a locus, so to speak, for spiritual organizations. They're building across the street at UN Center, across the street from the UN in New York on First Avenue, is itself filled with offices of religious organizations. And the World Conference on Religion and Peace, the Parliament of the World's Religions, the Alliance for Civilizations, these are very large bodies of spiritually involved and directed people. And more, I think the spiritual standard for humanity, is being asserted and felt at the UN. So I think that of course, it depends sometimes on the personalities of those involved and those at the top of the organization. I have felt for some time that the religions need to work more closely together, and that certainly the 3 Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, the Jewish, and the Muslims, need to establish a more concerted effort. They do come together from time to time, and there's a kind of a nice meeting, but there needs to be the exertion of the full values of respect and love as a basis for human conduct. That needs to be translated more efficiently and effectively. And who better to do that than the leaders of religions and those who are involved in the organizations that I have referred to. So I think that although we live in a highly secular age, that in which the role of religion per se seems to be diminished if you measure religion by number of people who go to church, but rather elevated to an understanding of people who have a value in how we treat one another and treat the planet. That those are spiritual values, and that to me acts as a basis for a culture of peace. A culture of peace is inherently religious, and or it's inherently spiritual in its dimensions, and so too with the protection of the environment. Of course, we have the Pope Francis's famous encyclical now, Laudato Si, in which he gives a sweeping view of the environment, protection of the environment, and how all of that is related to the social justice themes. The social justice themes come through in the issues of the economy and the environment and related areas. So I would encourage people to consider the spiritual dimensions of the problems that we're facing today need to be addressed in a more vigorous way that gets better translated into public policy.
I think your quotations from President Kennedy have inspired this next question. And the question is, would you say there are similarities between the Cuban Missile Crisis and the current Ukraine-Russian war?
Well, yes, I lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was more overt. The Soviets of the day were actually transporting missiles to Cuba, and they had to be intercepted. And the level of rhetoric was pretty high, and the intervention of the Secretary General at the time, Hugh Thant, played a role in getting Khrushchev and Kennedy to get on the same path toward resolving the crisis. Lesser known, perhaps, is the role of Pope John the 23rd at the time, when he, through his own back channels, communicated to Khrushchev and Kennedy and enabled them to communicate in a better way with each other. So the Cuban Missile Crisis was intense. But it had a time period. It ended when they resolved it. It was 13 days. It lasted 13 days. The Ukraine crisis is protracted, as Kathleen remarked earlier. We're down 108 days, and it shows no signs of ending. And the degree of danger it seems to me to be increasing as the war in Ukraine is prolonged. That is to say, will Putin find himself backed into a corner and thus, in a desperate all-out move at the end, use nuclear weapons? We can't, certainly, God forbid, but you cannot exclude that might happen. And thus, the very fact that we're living in a world in which leaders are capable of setting off nuclear weapons is an outrage. I mean, it's a disgrace to our whole intellectual, social, spiritual fabric that we've allowed ourselves to get into a situation in which countries have nuclear weapons. Why was a non-proliferation treaty not honored when it came into existence 50 years ago, 50 years ago? And so there's a lot of blame to be cast all around this whole business, and NATO's expansion and so on. I mean, we cannot deny that the war in Russia the war in Ukraine is caused by Russia's invasion. So it should be condemned. But in doing so, we should look at all the factors that brought us this far, and also look at the factors of common security as a negotiation to get out of this war, and with the least amount of people now going to be killed. So from a humanitarian as well as a geopolitical view, and not to mention economic, and then the global famine that's coming as a result of the shortages of food caused by the war, all of these things adding up to an imperative that this war must be ended. And therefore, a combination of spiritual and political and domestic and international values need to be brought into play. And we need leaders who will talk this way and who will bring publics with them. And what we're hearing is that the leaders saying we need more ammunition, more ammunition, more ammunition. This is not the route to a hopeful future.
The next question, not refuse to negotiate until he controls a great deal of Ukrainian territory. First question, and linked to it is the second one that says, should Ukraine then stop fighting and allow him to achieve this goal? Well,
now you're getting into technicalities to take me beyond my own. I think speakers have to be careful not to extend their opinions beyond their own range of competence. The war should be negotiated. There should be a negotiation to the end of this war, to end this war. So that negotiations, they started in a small way, even a couple of months ago, but they didn't have any steam to them. And the United States certainly has not supported Ukraine negotiating. It's quite the other way around. So I don't know if the war, a basis for negotiation to me seems to be to go back to the status quo ante. That is to say, the borders that existed on February 24th, go back to those borders. But I feel trapped in a way, because you're going to have this war go on just because we can't find a way of stopping it. I think that an outpouring of humanity and constructing a negotiating solution to end the war without more carnage is the only viable way that I can see forward. And just because I can't see the particular route today to that doesn't invalidate my overall position that there must be a negotiation to end this war.
Well, someone asks directly, well, do you actually believe that an individual mediator could serve to bring Russia and Ukraine to find a resolution to this?
Well, I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert in either Russia or Ukraine. I don't want to pretend to be. But certainly in the past, it is the ability of negotiators that have ended conflicts, and in Asia and Africa, there have been lots of wars have been ended by negotiations that were stimulated in the first place by the United Nations. So, I mean, I'm not here today, Kevin, to offer this audience a resolution of Ukrainian war. That's not my expertise. What I bring to this meeting is I hope, a vision of how to move the world into a culture of war, into a culture of peace from a culture of war. And so we do this by elevating our own standards and calling for nonviolence and the respect for the international rule of law, and a worldwide ceasefire, and working on collaboration, and to build the agenda for common security. I mean, these are all practical steps that point us forward. And I mean, I hope there's no more questions today directed to me on how to solve I didn't come here to solve the Ukraine war. I can't solve the Ukraine war. What I can do is offer you a way forward for building the conditions for peace through a culture of peace, and then leading to the right to peace. That's the direction that we must set. And I look to religious and spiritual people to move in that direction, not get bogged down in the nuts and bolts of how to get more ammunition for today's war.
With that, then let's go directly to that issue about the right to peace. So we're now shifting to your territory. What practical steps can Canada take to advance the right to peace? Is the government's commitment, admittedly lukewarm, commitment to increase our military expenditures to 2%, does this enhance or detract a commitment to the right to peace? And there's a fourth part. What alternative investments could we make to enhance common security and the right to peace? So a lot to disentangle there. So Canada and the right to peace politically, what's at play here?
Thank you. The 2%, this famous 2% of GDP to military expenditures is a spurious figure, picked out of thin air, and it guarantees a perpetuation of the military-industrial complex and its power. And it presupposes that the solution to our international problems will be by having a stronger military. And when I've been trying to argue here, as I argue all the time in my work, that the route to peace is through an enlargement of the values of the Charter of the United Nations, in which cooperation and common security are put into place. And what do I mean by that? Well, say, if you have, it needs to be negotiations for the elimination of nuclear weapons on a way in which there's mutually assured verification. Verification is, I'm not talking about unilateral disarmament, I'm talking about mutual assured, verifiable ways in which nations recognize that because of the power of instruments to annihilate humanity, and that's certainly not an exaggeration when you consider the power of 13,000 nuclear weapons today, if all hell breaks loose, that we work together on common solutions. The climate, the pandemic, nuclear weapons, migrations. What are we going to do with people who can't live in areas any longer because of the dire agricultural prospects for them as a result of climate change? These are problems that transcend national borders, and increasing our military budget to this famous 2% is exactly the wrong way to go. We need to invest more in the United Nations programs, more in programs that bring together international bodies, programs that directly address the migration of peoples, that address nuclear disarmament and address environmental protection. So this calls for leadership, not just a falling back in a knee-jerk reaction that we got to have more military. I mean, I can't speak strongly enough against this mentality, and I expect, and the people that I'm talking to today, I mean, I expect a stronger understanding of the flaws in military thinking as to get us out of to advance our society today. We don't advance our society by a stronger militarism and resurgence of militarism. We advance our society by asserting and implementing values in which we treat one another with respect. In the world, we have laws against discrimination and so on, and we have international laws against the possession of nuclear weapons. We have international laws against warfare. We need to strengthen the International Criminal Court as a means of punishing those who violate. We need to have international law respected and not just pushed off to the side. And all this panoply of issues that I'm touching on here revolve around a spiritual understanding of ourselves on this planet, that we are all united, we are all one, as human beings, and this is this ought to become a driving element in the formation of foreign policy, that we find. Let me put it this way, Kevin. For ages, we've been told that we should love one another because it's it's a good thing to do. When I certainly would second that at this point. But that, what we call that vertical line that has come down to us through the ages, is now intersecting with a horizontal line, which is the pragmatics. We have to do this. We have to get along. If we're not going to love one another, if that's too much for some, we've got to have a relationship. We have to have a dialogue. We've got to have diplomatic relations. We've got to deal with people so that in order to stop the threats to the world that come from these issues that are transnational. I've said to them here several times now: climate, pandemic, nuclear, migrations, and so on. So there's a beautiful unity in the world, just waiting to be discovered. And just because there are bigots and there are people who I won't mention names. Some you can think of what I'm thinking of now. Some leaders. We need to assert ourselves, and particularly if we dare to call ourselves Christians. To look at the Constitution on the Church in the modern world, as one example of how a religious, spiritual body can open its doors, so to speak, or as Pope John said, open the windows, to reach out to a suffering humanity, so that the griefs and joys, the griefs and anxieties, the joys and hopes of people around the world are those of ourselves too, because we recognize our unity with them. That is a driving idea that we need to impress periodically on our own minds in order that we can exert some influence on others.
Well, there's another driving idea here, and that is how decisions get made. I'll ask the question and then add a bit more. And it is, can you explain how the Parliament of Canada ever decided to increase our military spending at the rate of, and there's a statistic, but the most important thing is the rate was increased. Was there a parliamentary debate on this topic? The issue is, how do the participants in this session how do we get involved at this at the political level to ensure these things don't happen while we're looking somewhere else?
Yeah, well, that's probably well said. These things happen while we're looking somewhere else. But there was a parliamentary study on defense, and they recommended increased expenditures. There ought to be a foreign policy review by Parliament. I'm sort of at a loss to understand as to why we're not having it now. We're living at a period of great transformation in the world, or to quote Henry Kissinger, who's not one of my favorite people, but Kissinger said the other day that we're living a whole new world today, a whole new world in which the norms and frameworks that we had before of international law and international cooperation are folding, and we're reverting to bloc confrontation, which China and Russia and the United States are all going to confront one another. This is the formula for disaster. And when you come to Canada, I mean, here's Canada occupying the second largest geographical space in the world, and with a high degree of technology and industry and so on. I mean, if you look around the world, or if you go around the world as I have, and then you see Canada, what a remarkable opportunity we have as a result of being Canadians in this land to exert a stronger influence on policies, on international policies. So we need some leadership, and that raises the whole question of the kind of leaders we have today, and the kind of parliamentarians, and the kind of the processes we have to establish parliamentarians and the leaders of our political parties. It leaves a lot to be desired. But so we got to take the situation as it is, and each person, we can't let ourselves off the hook just by saying, well, they're not good enough in Parliament. We have to take some responsibility for what have we actually personally communicated with parliamentarians in a reasonable manner to provide some strength to them in trying to move. There are a lot of good people in that parliament. There are a lot of good people, but they're wandering around, and they're caught with all kinds of things that go on that distract and detract. So I just have to keep coming back to some key ideas of mutual security, common security in the world that we have to have. It's a spiritual and a pragmatic idea to have common security, that nobody's safe unless we're all safe. And nobody's safe from the pandemic unless we're all safe from the pandemic, and the same with the climate. And so we got to elevate our thinking, elevate the processes in which we interact with society, and that's a challenge for us. And as Christians, we ought to, if that's my audience here today, essentially Christians, I suppose, we ought to accept that we have a responsibility to our brothers and sisters around the planet, and by reflecting on the strength that we have here in Canada in a hurting world. And that, to me, just increases our obligation for action.
Well, thank you. I'm going to turn to Kathleen Monk for our final question. You've given us so much to think about. There are so, I mean, if we thought it was going to be complicated, this session, and entangled, you've reinforced for us the complexity, but you've been holding on to that one big theme of hope, which is, of course, your title. So Kathleen, you have the last question.
Yeah, well, this has been a great discussion so far. So thanks so much for your contributions. I work in politics. I'm one of those strange geeks that actually watches Question Period every day, and I see the nature of the debate, and it's pretty low level these days in our parliament and what we're focusing on. So I hear you ask for Canada to kind of move forward on its leading role as a peacemaker, and to strengthen that role in our capacity, strengthen that middle power role that we have, and that we did have to flex, if you want to use that word, a little bit when it came to the Michael situation, where we saw a little bit of Canada trying to convene those diplomatic conversations and re-engage in dialogue and diplomacy in order to free the two Michaels, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. You obviously remember that. But I guess I'll ask you more of a tactical, strategic question, Mr. Roche, as a former parliamentarian yourself, someone who sat both in the House and in the Senate. How do we cut through the noise and actually refocus the conversation on peace when it's so hot and it's so fiery right now and almost polarized, really? What would be your suggestion in terms of trying to invite people to have a dialogue that's reasoned? I'll give you one more quick example. I mean, I worked for Jack Layton, as you probably, maybe you don't know, but and I remember when I first started working for him, he called for dialogue with the Taliban, and when we first entered the war, and for years was mocked in the mainstream media and called Taliban Jack for his, even this near suggestion that we would have dialogue and diplomacy to end the conflict there, which went on for many years and frankly is still going on. So how would you say we could bring this dialogue and have a reasoned dialogue in our parliament and in our homes and in our communities?
Well, thank you, Kathleen. You and I are both involved from our different perspectives in this. Just because there are all these distractions doesn't mean that we can't elevate the discussion. And when it comes to members of parliament and senators too, but there are some very good people in there. There are some very good people, and there's a lot that are neither here nor there, I suppose, but there are some. And I sense that they try, but they're overwhelmed by the system, and the system is a confrontational system, and it's epitomized by the fact that the two sides are sitting opposite each other, and yelling back and forth and so on. It'd be a lot better if they configured the House of Commons in a circle. And so that, there wouldn't be this direct confrontation. That being said, it doesn't excuse the low level of conduct that one sees periodically, and maybe increasingly so, in the House of Commons. But Kathleen, let's not give up. There are. Our leaders need to be challenged. Jack Layton was right. I want to pay a tribute to him at this moment. And there are other persons. I don't want to start naming them now, but there are some whom I do respect. But they feel isolated, and they tell me too that they don't get enough support when they go into caucus. Kathleen, as you know, the morning question period there, the discussion about who's going to get the question, what it's going to be on, and they need some facts to back up the thing. Yes, the public is interested in this. The public does want to have a question on whether Canada is going to attend. A person close to you and close to me is having this very problem right now. That trying to get on the question period. Say, well, will Canada attend as an observer the meeting in Vienna on a treaty on prohibition of nuclear weapons? And the chairperson of the caucus says, well, nobody cares about that. We don't hear anything about it, you see. So the people who do want to elevate the discussion need to be backed up more, and they need to have more oomph. I mean, I don't know why it is that when I was in Parliament, and when I wanted to get a letter on something, I realized that it represented about 10 people who didn't didn't write, and therefore, it had some value. But most people, and I've been, Kathleen, I've been in this for 40 or 50 years, and it's the same story all the time. Most people underestimate their own capacity to influence the political system. And they think, well, they go and cast a vote every 4 years or whatever. And they write one letter. Oh, I wrote a letter. And that's when they got a form letter back. So what? They fail to realize if you send a letter back to a form letter, there's no form letter to the second letter. So people have they don't have enough. They don't have enough push to do. And thus, because of the complexity and diversity of issues being faced every day, things just slide and everything. And so we need a concerted effort by a key number of people. Margaret Mead said famously, you don't have to have 100%. You don't have to have 100% of society to change. You only need about 20-25% to get a critical mass that will change. That will change the opinion. And you get. If the Prime Minister walked into his office Monday morning and they said to him, "Oh, Prime Minister, we got 5,000 letters over the weekend on climate or on nuclear," he said, "Oh yeah, well, but if they got 5,000 more the next week too, they start to get attention." So the point I'm making here is that we, being the people, cannot let ourselves off the hook by just blaming those people in Ottawa. They ought to do more. Da 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 da. When we are the fabric of society, and we need to speak up and touch into the political system ourselves and have some resolve, determination, and guts in order to do that. That's what we need.
What an inspiring moment and words to end on. Very powerful, and circles back to your quote that I love so much, that hope is a verb, and we can make the change that we want to see. Over to you, Kevin. Is that right?
Yeah. Yes, it is. Thank you, Kathleen. And yeah, that was a rousing end there. Now, traditionally, we ask somebody who has something to say about the guest to comment on the presenter. And I argued vigorously that it was going to be me on this one. And I'll explain why. We have this afternoon been in the presence of a prophet. And prophets make life uncomfortable because they ask the tricky questions and they push. And you were one of the prophets that I met very early on when I arrived in Canada. When I arrived in Canada in 1974, you were in publishing, journalism, writing before your political career began. And you introduced Canadians to the work of Bishop Remy DeRue. You introduced Canadians to the work of Mary Jo Leddy. You engaged with Gregory Baum, Bill Ryan, these hugely prophetic figures who have had an influence on generations of Catholics. The thing about being in the presence of a prophet is it makes you feel awkward because it's inspiring and the issues are so big, but you have managed in the work that you do, that Kathleen outlined, to always draw attention to that which is possible and how we become engaged in that. For me, why it's been such a delight to talk to you today is what you know, but people on this call don't know, is that we first met, although I knew you from my Edmonton days and your journalism days and you were a member of Parliament and all of that, I actually worked with you on 3 of your books. In 2003, you wrote The Human Right to Peace. And in 2005, you wrote Beyond Hiroshima. And in 2007, you wrote Global Conscience. And I worked with you as the editor on each of those 3. And I tell you, it was a delight to work with you on these 3. And the first reason why is because it was easy. What I mean is your works, I moved a comma here and moved a sentence there. The works were fully rendered, a person writing at the top of their form. But you challenged and inspired many readers with those books and continue to challenge and inspire many readers with those books and the books that followed. And what you did today, we want answers. And you very thoughtfully reminded us that the solution to things that disturb us aren't going to come from you. You are not there to give an easy answer to make us feel better. You are there to make us be like Liechtenstein. And I love that image that you gave, that little Liechtenstein made the difference. And in a sense, I think my experience of listening to you today is that you made me feel like Liechtenstein, that I had this little bit of power, and if only I could engage it, if only it could have influence in the right place, we would begin to create the circumstances that you talked about, and that creating that space and building small steps moving forward to an understanding and a recognition of the overwhelming significance and importance of the human right to peace. So thank you for today. It's been a remarkable session. Many of the comments say, wow, they're not about questions, but they are responsive of recognizing that we have been in the presence of an important prophet today. And I thank you on behalf of everybody on this call today and on behalf of the Conversations for Our Times program, at which point I now turn over to Father Winkler.
I just want to say how wonderfully moving this whole presentation was for me personally. We've ended this last year with this session, which was one of the most important conversations for our times as we speak. We started this series to celebrate our 60th anniversary as a parish. And it started with a small idea that we would invite speakers to talk about things that are important to us, because we also believe that as a parish community, we're all headed towards spiritual growth. We all seek spiritual growth. And part of that comes from awareness of the world around us. So it was interesting, Mr. Roche, that you mentioned Gaudium et Spes, because that document during the Second Vatican Council encouraged us to be aware of the signs of the times. And that's why we call this Conversations for Our Times. Spiritual growth depends on awareness. And that's why we've had this series. We've had speakers who are local here in Ottawa, both experts and theologians. We've had Dr. Catherine Clifford, Lorraine St. Marie, Anne Louise Mahoney. We've had Kevin Burns give a beautiful presentation, and we've had Reverend Dr. Anthony Bailey to speak to us on racism. And then some of the talks, because Zoom happened, because the pandemic happened, we were able to expand the talks, and there we've been able to invite Cardinal Michael Cherney. We've had Mary Jo Letty. We've had Sister Nuala Kenny. We've had Howard Ross, an expert on racism from the United States. We've had Andre Picard, our own Canadian expert writer on health. We've had Sister Eva Solomon speak on reconciliation within our church. We've had Mark Carney. And then even some talk about our own parish community, kind of the legacy of the two major religious orders that founded this parish, the Basilian Fathers. We had the Superior General Kevin Story, who started our series, and we've had Sister Jean Goulet, who is a Sister of Holy Cross. Both of those communities were the worker bees and the beginning of our parish. I want to offer you a gift. We have my niece's beads. She's a native girl, and she does beading, and we offer, I forgot to mention Simon Apolloni. He was also very instrumental in our awareness of the planet. But I'm offering, I want to show you this. I hope you can see it. Up like this. This is a beaded dove, which is the symbol of peace in our world. And in the dove, you see an Ojibwe floral design, because as Indigenous people, we want peace too, and we want reconciliation too. because we have always been concerned about the survival of our future generations. So this is an offering to you to thank you for your wisdom and your prophetic voice today. Am I forgetting anything? I think that's what I have to say. This is our last Zoom series presentation, and we're hoping to continue next year with more conversations for our time. So thank you to all involved. Thanks to Kevin Burns. Thanks to Kathleen Monk. Thanks to our committee, Rosemary Williams, Narita Fleming, Elizabeth Elliott, and all the people of our parish who have been supporting this Zoom series. So thank you, and God bless all of you. God bless us all. May God bless us with a culture of peace, and may we strive to work for it. Thank you.